An eerie stillness engulfs Bradford and its suburbs as the lockdown takes effect. A storm was coming, one of which had never been seen before. Road and rail traffic were depleted, as only necessary vehicles could travel. Everyone was ordered to stay at home and not to mix with other households, fed by the media's paranoia and hysteria. Entire industrial estates closed. Waterways closed. Pubs, cafes, hotels and small businesses closed. All places of worship closed. Guests couldn't attend weddings. Shopping arcades closed. All museums closed. Schools, colleges, universities closed. Theatres and cinemas closed. Recreational facilities closed. Sports venues closed. Bradford Centre almost deserted. Closed shops in towns and city centres. Among those that could remain open were chemists and food shops. Construction projects came to a halt. An unprecedented sight. Leeds Bradford Airport closed. All its aircrafts grounded. In crematoriums, families couldn't attend the funerals of their loved ones. Those who could worked from home. Those who couldn't work were partially supported by government financial schemes. Only people with vital jobs were allowed to travel to work. These were termed key workers, such as the emergency services, medical staff, logistics workers, carers, necessary retail workers. Fuel stations were kept open in order for people to travel. Students studied online. This closed primary school displayed the children's support for the NHS, as did many households. Previously much maligned by the media, NHS workers were now considered national heroes, as they were seen to be the only saviour in the battle against COVID-19, as it was now called. Local surgeries were closed to their patients. Anything other than COVID-related illness took a back step. Queuing became the norm as people could only go out for food and vital necessities. Only so many customers were allowed inside at once. Keeping a 2-metre distance and wearing masks, particularly inside, was compulsory. People's lives revolved around DIY stores, garden centres and food stores. Two hours exercise a day was allowed, so local parks were kept open. But all the facilities were out of bounds. Public car parks were closed. Parents were, however, increasingly bonding with their children, playing and walking together outside, as there was no school or work to go to. The air was clean and fresh due to low pollution levels. As the lockdown continued, people increasingly adapted. Volunteers offered to shop or bring meals to the elderly and housebound. Non-essential stores adapted by running click and collect systems of shopping. VE Day, and people celebrated it over their garden walls. More people took to walking in rural areas, while the farms continued to feed the country. Delivery drivers supplied the ever-increasing online shopping market. They continued to supply the DIY stores and supermarkets. Council workers continued with vital services. The mail still had to be delivered. Even litter picking continued. The trains and buses carried fewer passengers as they had to keep a 2-metre distance in the seating arrangements. Up to 6 people from different households could now gather together outside. Open-air markets were allowed. Takeaways were already allowed, but as major franchises reopened for takeaways, people flocked to the drive-thrus. Airports could open, but with limits to foreign travel, mainly domestic flights and private charters were all that was possible. Test centres were set up around Bradford to allow the public to be checked for COVID-19 infection. Those who tested positive were to self-isolate for up to 2 weeks. July the 4th saw the reopening of pubs, cafes, restaurants, museums and non-essential shops. Although measures still had to be taken for keeping a 2-metre distance when inside. COVID cases continued to level off. Indoor concerts, casinos, theatres, cinemas could all reopen. Weddings were allowed up to 30 people. Funerals were allowed 30 people, but held outside. Ironically, most masks were made in China. Early September, and schools, colleges and universities could reopen. The easing off apparently had been too premature. COVID cases were reported to have reached 1 million. The tier system was introduced. Bradford was initially put into Tier 2, which meant the restriction of household mixing again. Only essential shops and businesses could remain open. Nationally, various regions were put into Tiers 1, 2 or 3, depending on the rate of infection, 3 being the highest. There was no travelling from a higher tier to a lower tier area. However, this was virtually unenforceable. By now, COVID deaths nationally were reported to be around 75,000. The government ordered further restrictions. These were not, however, taken as seriously as the first lockdown, as many more people were becoming less tolerant of the situation. With many shops closed, Christmas shopping was increasingly done online. Bradford was now in Tier 3, as COVID cases were reported to be particularly high in the area. National cases had exceeded 1 million. The government announced that on Christmas Day, up to 3 households could meet indoors. From Boxing Day up to New Year's Day, Bradford remained in Tier 3. The infection rate was reported to have risen over Christmas, and the country was put into a 3rd lockdown. This was the beginning of an intolerable winter, with no work, no school, no social life. However, some people, in spite of having everything taken from them, were going to make the best of what little they had left. As the weeks passed, the mundane routine of the previous year repeated with tedious monotony. The queuing continued, whatever the weather. Over February, recently developed vaccinations began. The vaccines, mainly produced by AstraZeneca and Pfizer, were to be given to the population in 2 doses, starting with the elderly and eventually working through to young people by late summer. With vaccinations taking effect on older people, infection figures were reported to be decreasing. And from April the 12th through to May the 17th, rules were gradually relaxed and businesses began to reopen. However, many businesses were never to survive the lockdown. Debenhams never recovered. Demonstrations against the lockdown were held all over the country.
Anti-social distancing does not work. You need to meet people and shake hands and talk to them in order to boost your immune system. So, I say to you now,
check it out, the 11th of March, in the whole world, 7 billion, there was only 4,291 deaths in the whole world.
Reports of a new Indian variant of the COVID virus were now announced. This meant the anticipated relaxing of the present rules were extended for another month. It was the longest day of the year. People could at least gather in pubs to watch the UEFA Cup finals. With many more people now double vaccinated and COVID figures reported to be falling, restrictions could be lifted. People celebrated. Families and friends could now see each other. Masks were no longer compulsory. However, the pandemic was still not over. The damage done by the lockdown was considerable, financially, socially, educationally, and health-wise. The threat, we are told, still remains indefinitely.